What if I told you that hidden away in the Vatican's most secret archives, sealed behind layers of papal security, and marked too dangerous, too grotesque, too real, lies the preserved anatomical remains of a European monarch whose physical deformity was so shocking that it literally brought down an empire, that it caused 4 wives to die from trauma, terror, and despair? And what if I told you that the screams of his wedding nights echoed through palace halls for decades, subscribing and tapping that like button? If you enjoy history's darker corners, if you're drawn to the secrets most would rather forget, then you're in the right place. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It still amazes me how our shared curiosity connects us across centuries. Picture this: Madrid, 1834. King Ferdinand VII is dead, and the royal physician has been summoned for one final, absolutely horrifying task. He's been ordered to preserve the king's anatomical deformity for posterity, and as he stares down at what lies before him on that cold marble table, he literally cannot believe what he's seeing. This grotesque monument to royal dysfunction, measures over 14 inches and has the girth that varies so dramatically that contemporary medical documents describe it as like a billiard cue, thin at the root, but thick as a grown man's fist at the end, long as a walking cane. The physician's hands are literally shaking as he works, because he knows he's looking at something that destroyed 4 marriages, caused multiple miscarriages, led to at least 3 suspicious deaths, and single-handedly brought the Spanish monarchy to its knees. But here's where the story gets even more twisted, because Ferdinand's deformity wasn't just some random medical anomaly. No, this was the direct result of centuries of the most disgusting, systematic inbreeding you can possible. Imagine. The Habsburg and Bourbon royal families had been marrying their own cousins, uncles, nieces, and siblings for so long that by the time Ferdinand was born, his family tree looked more like a pretzel than an actual tree. We're talking about generations of mental illness, physical deformities, and what court documents literally describe as fragile minds trapped in broken bodies. Ferdinand himself was the product of first cousins Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma. And guys, when I show you the genetic disaster that created this monster, you're going to understand exactly why this story is so absolutely unhinged. Ferdinand was born on October 14th, 1784, and at first, nobody really noticed anything too unusual. Sure, he was a weird kid, kind of awkward, maybe a little off, but royal children were often strange, so the court just brushed it off as typical royal weirdness. But as Ferdinand hit puberty, something absolutely horrifying began to emerge. What had initially been dismissed as just awkward growth became completely undeniable by the time he was 15 years old. Court physicians were literally called in to examine what was happening, and their secret medical reports, which somehow survived in hidden archives for over 2 centuries, described their horror in graphic detail. Dr. Francisco Javier de Balmas, the royal physician, wrote in his encrypted notes that Ferdinand's condition was beyond the scope of medical understanding, a grotesque deviation from human anatomy that defies both nature and divine intention. But it gets worse, because Dr. Balmas went on to document the exact measurements, the unusual curvature, and what he described as unknown tissue growths that appear to serve no biological function. He measured it at over 10 inches when non-aroused and noted that intimate relations would be impossible without severe injury or significant modification, guys. They were literally talking about surgically altering this thing just so Ferdinand could have a normal marriage. And here's where the psychological trauma really begins, because Ferdinand was growing up in what can only be described as the most toxic, dysfunctional royal court in European history. His father, Charles IV, was completely absent, more interested in hunting and clockmaking than ruling, while his mother, Maria Louisa, was having a very public, very scandalous affair with Manuel de Godoy, the prime minister. The entire Spanish court knew about this affair. Foreign diplomats were writing about it in their official reports, and Ferdinand was watching his mother openly humiliate his father, while the entire kingdom whispered and laughed behind their backs. But the psychological damage went way deeper than just family dysfunction, because Ferdinand was also dealing with the constant mockery and horror of everyone who discovered his condition. Palace servants would literally run away when they accidentally saw him changing clothes. Foreign envoys would write shocked reports back to their home countries describing the Spanish prince's anatomical monstrosity. Court ladies would whisper and point and cross themselves when he walked by. Ferdinand absorbed all of this betrayal, this humiliation, this absolute degradation, and it transformed him into something truly monstrous. By the time he was 18, Ferdinand was already showing signs of the cruel paranoia that would define his entire reign. Anyone who accidentally saw his naked body would be immediately exiled from court, and their entire families would be banned from royal service. Servants who had to help him dress were sworn to secrecy under threat of death, and Ferdinand actually did execute several people who he suspected of gossiping about his condition. This wasn't just royal vanity, guys. This was a young man whose physical deformity was turning him into a monster, and everyone around him was about to pay the price. The first real victim was Maria Antonia of Naples, Ferdinand's first cousin, who was arranged to marry him in 1802. She was 19 years old, completely innocent, and had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her on her wedding night. The marriage negotiations had been handled entirely by diplomats and courtiers, and Maria Antonia had been told only that Ferdinand was a devoted Catholic prince with strong traditional values. Nobody, and I mean nobody, had prepared her for what she was about to encounter. The wedding night was an absolute catastrophe that traumatized everyone involved. According to court records that were sealed for over 2 centuries, Maria Antonia's screams could be heard throughout the entire royal wing of the palace. She literally screamed the word "monster" so loudly that guards came running, thinking she was being murdered. When they burst into the royal chambers, they found Maria Antonia backed against the wall, trembling and pointing at Ferdinand, who was standing naked in the center of the room, with his deformity fully visible. What happened next is so disturbing that I almost can't believe it's real. But multiple independent sources confirm every detail. Court physicians were immediately summoned, along with specially designed cushions that had been secretly manufactured for this exact situation. Maria Antonia was given massive doses of laudanum to sedate her, while Ferdinand screamed at the doctors to make it work and threatened to have everyone executed if they couldn't solve his problem. They literally had to drug his wife unconscious before any physical intimacy could be attempted, and even then, the results were catastrophic. This became the horrible pattern of their marriage. Every encounter had to be pre-planned like a military operation, with teams of physicians standing by, custom cushions and positioning devices, multiple tiares, pipes of oils and salves, and enough laudanum to keep Maria Antonia sedated throughout the entire ordeal. After each encounter, she would be moved to a separate wing of the palace to recover for days or sometimes weeks, while Ferdinand would rage and blame her lack of cooperation for their failure to produce an heir. Ferdinand became absolutely obsessed with conception, convinced that if he could just get his wife pregnant, it would somehow prove that he was normal, that his deformity wasn't really a problem, that he could be a successful king and husband. This obsession drove him into complete madness. He started consulting fortune tellers, mystics, and charlatans who promised they could help him conceive an heir. He had custom leather restraints made with silk padding to ensure optimal positioning during intimacy. He timed their encounters according to moon phases, astrological charts, and bizarre ceremonies that combined Catholic rituals with pagan fertility rites. The most disturbing part is that Ferdinand's desperation actually worked twice. Maria Antonia did get pregnant, and for brief moments, Ferdinand thought his nightmare was over. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages, and court physicians privately documented that her body had been too severely damaged, both emotionally and physically, to successfully carry children to term. The trauma of her marriage had literally broken her reproductive system. Maria Antonia spent her final years as basically a ghost haunting the Spanish palace. She was addicted to laudanum, which was the only thing that made her daily existence bearable. Servants described her as having hollow, haunted eyes and a voice that never rose above a whisper. She would flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room, and foreign diplomats wrote that seeing her was like looking upon a living corpse, a woman whose soul had been murdered while her body continued breathing. She died in 1807, officially from fever, but everyone knew she had really died from despair and complete psychological breakdown. Ferdinand's response to his first wife's death was to immediately start looking for a second victim. In 1816, he married Maria Isabella of Portugal, his 19-year-old cousin. And guys, what happened to this poor girl makes the first marriage look merciful in comparison. By this point, Ferdinand's condition had actually gotten worse with age, and his psychological state had deteriorated into complete paranoid madness. The wedding night was so traumatic that servants found broken furniture, bloodied linens, and Maria Isabel unconscious on the floor the next morning. But here's where Ferdinand's cruelty really escalates, because by now he had convinced himself that his wife's terror was actually mockery, that they were deliberately trying to humiliate him by showing fear of his body. Maria Isabel's natural trauma responses, her trembling voice, her flinching when he touched her, her dramatic weight loss and loss of appetite, Ferdinand interpreted all of this as deliberate insults to his dignity as king. He started intercepting her letters to her family, forbidding her from speaking to anyone without his permission, and having her followed by spies who reported back on every conversation. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's obsession with his deformity was turning into a full-blown medical theater. He started holding private conferences in the palace, bringing in anatomists, surgeons, and even circus performers who specialized in unusual anatomical specimens. These meetings would take place in a specially prepared chamber where Ferdinand would stand naked on a velvet platform while teams of men examined, measured, and discussed his condition like he was some kind of scientific specimen. Maria Isabel would be forced to wait behind a screen while her husband was poked and prodded and analyzed, listening to detailed discussions of his anatomy and their failed attempts at intimacy. These medical conferences became the subject of underground scholarly journals throughout Europe. Universities in Paris, Vienna, and London were receiving detailed reports about Ferdinand's condition, and academic debates were being held about the Spanish anatomical anomaly. Ferdinand's deformity had literally become a topic of international scientific interest, while his wife was reduced to a patient being studied alongside him. Maria Isabel's psychological breakdown was even more rapid and complete than her predecessors. She stopped eating almost entirely, barely slept, and servants reported that she would spend hours staring at shadows on the wall and talking to people who weren't there. When she died in 1818, officially from nervous exhaustion, Ferdinand became convinced that she had been murdered. He ordered multiple autopsies, had several of her attendants arrested and tortured for confessions, and started collecting death masks of all his wives, which he would whisper to during his frequent bouts of insomnia. By the time Ferdinand was looking for his third wife, his reputation had spread throughout European royal circles. He was now known as El Deformado, the deformed one, and princesses throughout the continent were declining marriage proposals from Spain. Families were demanding separate bedrooms, limited contact, and medical examinations before agreeing to any arrangements. Finally, Maria Josepha of Saxony agreed to marry him, but only because she approached the entire thing as a kind of medical experiment. Maria Josepha kept detailed journals of their marriage, treating Ferdinand's condition and their attempts at intimacy like scientific research. She documented measurements, timing, positioning techniques, and the physical and emotional effects of each encounter. Ferdinand found her clinical approach almost more disturbing than his previous wife's error, because she made him feel like a laboratory specimen rather than a husband. This scientific detachment drove Ferdinand into even deeper paranoia, and he became convinced that Maria Josepha was documenting everything to send intelligence reports back to the Saxon court. The most insane part of this entire story happened in 1829, when Maria Josepha actually became pregnant and carried the baby for 7 months. This was Ferdinand's first viable pregnancy after decades of failure, and his response was to completely lose his mind with obsessive protection. He hired elite guards to watch Maria Josepha around the clock, had all her food blessed by priests and tested by multiple tasters, brought in doctors from across Europe, and consulted with mystics, fortune tellers, and religious fanatics who promised to ensure a successful birth. When Maria Josepha went into premature labor due to placental abruption, Ferdinand was convinced that someone was trying to sabotage his heir. He refused to allow conventional medical treatment, instead demanding that the court physicians use experimental procedures that he had read about in underground medical journals. Ferdinand actually stood in the delivery room throughout the entire birth, screaming orders at the doctors and accusing them of deliberately causing complications. The baby, a daughter, died within hours of birth, and Maria Josepha died several days later from infection. Ferdinand's response was to refuse to allow either body to be buried, demanding that the physicians attempt revival procedures until rigor mortis had fully set in. He convinced himself that if he could just find the right combination of medicines, prayers, and medical procedures, He could bring both his wife and daughter back to life. But here's where this story takes its most twisted turn, because Ferdinand's fourth and final marriage was to Maria Cristina of Naples in 1830, and she was already visibly pregnant with another man's child when they got married. This wasn't some secret scandal, guys. Everyone knew, including Ferdinand. Maria Cristina had been having an affair with a distant cousin, and Ferdinand married her specifically because she was pregnant, convincing himself that divine will had provided him with an heir through miraculous intervention. Princess Isabella was born in 1830, and Ferdinand proclaimed her his legitimate daughter and heir to the throne, even though literally everyone knew she wasn't his biological child. This created the most bizarre psychological situation imaginable, because Ferdinand simultaneously celebrated Isabella as his greatest success while knowing she was proof of his ultimate failure as a man. He would spend hours staring at her, comparing her features to portraits of himself and Maria Cristina, hiring genealogists and even anatomists to provide scientific proof of her paternity, all while knowing the truth. Ferdinand's final years were characterized by complete paranoid breakdown. He had peepholes installed throughout the palace walls so he could spy on Maria Cristina and Isabella constantly. He developed elaborate food-tasting rituals that required multiple servants to test every dish and wait 30 minutes for potential poison symptoms, and several servants actually collapsed from exhaustion during these procedures. Maria Cristina was essentially living in what she described as a glass cage, with every letter intercepted, every conversation monitored, and constant loyalty tests administered by Ferdinand's growing army of spies. Foreign diplomats were horrified by what the Spanish court had become, marriage negotiations with other royal family, as completely stalled because nobody wanted to associate with Ferdinand's regime. The Spanish treasury was being drained by the massive security apparatus Ferdinand had created to monitor his own family, while the actual business of governing the kingdom was completely ignored. Spain was falling apart politically and economically, while Ferdinand spent his days obsessing over his wife's loyalty and his daughter's paternity. The final degradation came when Ferdinand started requiring medical inspections before any physical intimacy with Maria Cristina, having court physicians examine both of them to ensure optimal conditions for conception, even though everyone knew she was using contraceptive measures to prevent any actual pregnancy. Ferdinand had lost any remaining connection to human dignity, treating his marriage like a medical experiment and his wife like a laboratory animal. Ferdinand's physical and mental decline accelerated rapidly in 1832 and 1833. He stopped eating regularly, gave increasingly incoherent speeches, and his body began showing signs of the lifelong psychological torment he had endured. Court physicians noted that his famous deformity was actually causing physical complications as he aged, creating circulation problems and chronic pain that made his already fragile mental state even worse. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, officially from gout, but everyone knew he had really died from a lifetime of psychological torture, self-inflicted and otherwise. His final request was that his anatomical deformity be preserved for posterity, measured one final time at over 14 inches, with dramatically varying girth, and sealed away where it could never again destroy lives or kingdoms. The royal physician who performed this final task wrote in his private journal that Ferdinand's preserved remains were too dangerous, too grotesque, too real to be displayed or studied, and they were secretly transferred to the Vatican archives, where they remain sealed to this day. The Catholic Church declared Ferdinand's remains too disturbing for public knowledge, fearing that the full extent of royal family dysfunction would undermine monarchical authority throughout Europe. Ferdinand's legacy is one of the most devastating examples in European history of how personal trauma and physical abnormality can destroy not just an individual life, but entire political systems. His 4 wives died from trauma and despair. His daughter Isabella grew up knowing her father was mentally unstable, and her paternity was a public lie. And Spain spent decades recovering from the political chaos of his reign. The Spanish monarchy never fully recovered its prestige or authority after Ferdinand's death, and historians directly trace multiple 19th century political crises to the psychological damage he inflicted on royal institutions. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Ferdinand's story is how completely preventable it all was. If the royal families of Europe hadn't spent centuries marrying their own relatives, if Ferdinand had received proper medical care and psychological support instead of shame and mockery, If anyone had prioritized his mental health over political convenience, none of this horror would have been necessary. Instead, Ferdinand became a monster because he was treated like one, and his monstrosity destroyed everyone around him. The preserved evidence of Ferdinand's deformity, still sealed in the Vatican archives after nearly 2 centuries, serves as a grotesque monument to royal dysfunction, a reminder of what happens when pain, shame, and obsession are given absolute power over other human lives. Ferdinand couldn't rule his own body, so he let his failure define his entire kingdom, and the price was paid by his wives, his subjects, his daughter, and his historical legacy. This is what happens when genetic disaster meets political power, when personal trauma becomes public policy, and when a single individual's psychological breakdown is allowed to drag an entire nation into chaos. Ferdinand VII wasn't just the most deformed king in history. He was proof that sometimes the real monsters aren't born. They're created by the very systems that are supposed to protect and nurture them. And the evidence of his monstrosity, preserved in papal secrecy, continues to serve as a warning about the price of royal dysfunction and the human cost of political power unchecked by basic human decency.
Oh, no.